how I think the Christian narrative gets us wrong. The Christian narrative, or at least an essential part of this, is that human beings were created by God in His image, that we rebelled against God and are therefore fallen and are in need of redemption. We can't redeem ourselves. We have a propensity for sin. We need God to step in and fix us. The mechanism that Christianity proposes for this is some kind of ritual blood sacrifice in which God sacrifices Himself to Himself in order to lift from us the penalty and burden of sin. We are healed, made whole, and now we can go forward without sin. So the whole Christian creation fall myth is, in the first place, an etiological tale intended to explain why there is sin and evil in the world. It then proposes a cure for this, a solution. I don't find this narrative particularly compelling or convincing when I look at the evolutionary history of the human species. I think that many of the problems that we have today stem from the fact that we have evolved certain traits and behaviours which served us well at an earlier stage in our history, but which no longer do so, that have in fact become a hindrance. People often speak incorrectly of evolution as if it were purposeful or goal-directed. It isn't. Evolution is an entirely reactive process. Certain traits offer a survival advantage under certain conditions. Those with this particular trait have a higher reproductive output and survival rate than those without it. It's a reaction to the conditions around the organism. So, for instance, some phenotypes that better tolerate the cold will have a reproductive advantage during cold periods. If these cold periods persist for a long time, as for example during an ice age, these traits may become fixed in the population. The warm preferring phenotypes may become extinct. If warm conditions return, this species will not be adapted to these conditions and may not have sufficient genetic variation within the population to allow some to survive. A characteristic that is an advantage in some conditions may become fatal when the circumstances change. Consider malaria and sickle cell anemia in human beings. If a person has 2 copies of the sickle cell gene, one from each parent, that person will develop sickle cell anemia, which can be life-threatening. If you have only 1 copy of the gene, you will develop some sickle cells, but not enough to cause a problem. But in an area where malaria is prevalent, this will actually provide the person with some degree of protection against malaria because the Plasmodium parasite struggles to reproduce in these deformed sickle cells. And this results in a reduced level of infection. So this gives these people a survival advantage over those with normal blood cells in an area where malaria is prevalent. Thus, selection will ensure the survival of the sickle cell genotype in the population, even though having 2 copies of the gene causing it may prove fatal. It pays off to have one parent who carries the gene and one who doesn't. So an otherwise unhealthy mutation actually provides a selective advantage in these conditions. My point is that evolution doesn't think ahead. Wherever malaria is eradicated, the persistence of this sickle cell anemia type will become detrimental. Evolution acts in response to external conditions and circumstances. If those circumstances change, there's no guarantee that the traits that have evolved as a result of this process of selection will continue to provide an advantage under different conditions. Such traits may become a handicap. The genus Homo, of which we are a species, evolved on the African savanna, And characteristics that once served us well in that environment may not serve us well in our complex urban environment. For example, it's much more difficult to perceive the real threats in our current environment than it was out on the savannah. On the savannah, it may have been advantageous to be able to quickly identify a threat and either eliminate it, if possible, or run otherwise. The adrenaline kicks in and we act one way or the other. It didn't really matter if sometimes we got this wrong, maybe killed an animal or maybe even another person that wasn't actually a threat to us. It's better to be safe than sorry. Err on the side of caution. Threats in our society are much more difficult to identify and more difficult to deal with. Sometimes it may seem as though there are threats on all sides, and our physiological responses remain the same. If we see threats everywhere but can't properly identify them or deal with them, our adrenaline levels will remain high with no outlet. Hence, I would say, road rage. What was once adaptive may no longer be so, but evolution cannot respond quickly enough to deal with that. Anyway, we tend to adapt our environment to us rather than adapting to it. Evolution has nothing to work on if people with a greater capacity to endure the cold, on the one hand, and others with a greater capacity to endure the heat, can both live in a moderate, controlled environment, as many of us do today. Neither phenotype has a survival advantage, so no selection. We as a species clearly have a large brain capacity and ability to reason. But we also have brain structures that encourage us to bypass this much slower and more difficult process of rational thinking. Again, this may have survival advantage out on the savannah, where quick decisions may be a matter of life or death. But these processes still kick in today, when the long, slow process is what's often required. The rapid processes persist because they're still often good enough, and the slow process is time and energy consuming. In our original habitat, killing another person may be a good thing. It may give us a clear survival advantage if it results in more mating opportunities and more resources for us. But as society becomes more complex, cooperation and even altruism may offer selective advantages. These two behaviours may co-evolve and coexist, each being favoured under a certain set of conditions. In our complex modern societies, both impulses continue to exist. Even though we have laws and penalties to limit the killing of others, we still sanction that in some circumstances. We've also developed sports, team sports, combat sports, which allow for a limited outlet for these impulses. But we still often want to kill other people, even if we do actually refrain from doing so. And all of the chemical processes that are associated with that occur just as they always did. Over the centuries, we've found ways to deal with our less helpful impulses, through education, for instance, socialization. And despite what people tend to think, the world is much safer now and more peaceful now than it was, say, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago. I know many of you will flatly deny this, but do a little bit of research. Check the facts. Nevertheless, we still carry within us these evolutionary relics, these impulses, behaviours, physiological processes that once served us well and may sometimes still serve us well. I still want to be able to run away and climb a tree if I happen to find myself facing a lion on the African savannah. Very often, though, these things are a hindrance to us today. The solution? Well, I think despite the setbacks that we continue to experience, we're pretty much on the right track. More education, more rational thinking, more discussion. Obviously, we still face enormous difficulties, and I don't believe for one second that we'll simply miraculously address all of these. They're complex issues that require complex solutions, and we may fail. Interestingly, one of the main challenges that we face, probably the main challenge, is climate change. I think these problems are not even all the result of sin or wrongdoing. Some of them, sure, but many of them are just mistakes, perhaps not deliberate sin or evil doing. And I'm sure that no one who first used oil or coal to heat their home or electricity to light it or drove the first cars were sinning. They wouldn't have perceived themselves as doing anything wrong. The consequences were, at the time, unforeseen and probably unforeseeable. We have 2020 hindsight. I think these evolutionary processes that I've been describing are a sufficient explanation for all of the behaviours, feelings, impulses, and so on that Christianity likes to identify as sin. But this is not rebellion against God. Christianity has misdiagnosed the illness and therefore proposed a useless remedy.